Well, good afternoon, everybody. We've come to the last lecture in this series on the New Deal. Um, as you recall, our speaker today, Donna Waller, opened our program a few weeks ago, talking about the roots of the New Deal programs and the progressive programs in the late 1800s, right up to the Wilson administration. So since then, we've had a good hard look at the Depression itself and the New Deal programs that it spawned. And today, Don is going to carry forward from that point to how the New Deal programs have influenced American political life beyond that, the legacy of the New Deal. And with that, I'll turn it over to Donna.
To those of you who were here for my first talk, this is even worse. And I'm gonna, you may recall that I said that I usually did that one in 2 lectures. And this one is, was even more challenging in a bunch of different ways, but I'm gonna try to talk really rapidly so that I have some time for some questions. And what I want to do, for those of you who like to know structure, if I were still a chalk and talk person, you'd be looking at an outline and you'd know this. What I'm going to do is give you kind of a summary of the New Deal. I've watched everyone else's sessions, and we've talked about a lot of individual aspects of the New Deal, but I want to start by just giving you a very quick overview. And then I'm going to indicate to you, and I'm still in my head playing with whether I should make the actual legacies the punchline or plug them in right after I talk about the New Deal, which is probably what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to tell you how these legacies play out in subsequent administrations and times. So let me just begin by talking about the New Deal itself. And because I lectured about the New Deal endlessly and for about 30 years, I think of it in the way that one of the history textbooks that we used at Santa Fe, and I don't even remember which one, sort of summarized it. And it was the 3 R's, okay? The New Deal was about recovery from the Great Depression, about relief, and about reform. And if you think about successes and failures of the New Deal, as you're going to see, as a mechanism for recovering from the Great Depression, the New Deal was actually a failure. In 1940, when we began mobilizing for World War II, the unemployment rate was still 22%. And so if you think about New Deal programs as having helped the country recover from the Great Depression economically, you're looking at a failure there, because what made the recovery happen was actually mobilizing for World War II, not the New Deal. In terms of relief to individuals, that's a thing that I'll get back to. But there, the New Deal was definitely a matter of success. Millions of people, and you've heard about that in a variety of ways over the last couple of weeks. Millions of individuals got relief from the consequences of the Great Depression, from the New Deal. But in many ways, and you'll see this, the last star reform has actually been the most lasting consequence of the New Deal itself. The struggle for reform, and in the first class, I indicated to you that America had gone through several waves of embracing reform. The struggle for continued reform continues in a variety of different ways, as you'll see. So let me quickly just remind you that the New Deal had two parts. The first part, and they're known as the first and second New Deal. And the first part, basically 1933 through 35, barely made a dent in the Great Depression. It was definitely designed for recovery. And, they tried all kinds of different experiments in order to try to grapple with the immediate consequences of the Great Depression. And by the way, if you ask American historians what the most important events in American history so far have been, there's enormous consensus on that. About 85% of them will say the American Civil War, and the other 15% will say the Great Depression. Those are hands down the two most galvanizing incidents in American history. So the first New Deal, experimental, brought relief to lots of people, but definitely not enough. And in very short order, two things happened in the wake of the first New Deal. One was that the business community, which did not like a lot of the New Deal programs, then as now, laissez-faire was the guiding aspect of the business side of the economy. By 1934, the corporations had begun fighting back over the gains that labor had made under the first New Deal. And even more importantly, the heart of the New Deal, the National Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court within a year of their enactment. What this produced, and some of you may know that Phyllis Saranen brought this up a couple of weeks ago. What that produced was chaos. Okay. By 1934, the New Deal was faced with labor militancy that took the form of strikes in which strikers battled with local police, took over factories. generally struggled physically to hold on to the gains they had made in the first New Deal. And the New Deal began receiving, because of the chaos and because unemployment was still at about a third of the labor force. The Roosevelt administration began to face extreme criticism and extremism from both the left and the right. And you want to recognize that Roosevelt himself definitely by about 1935 was very concerned by the rise of fascism in Europe. He was already, when you think about Roosevelt as a leader, he's remarkably farsighted. And as soon as fascism begins in Europe, he's onto it. And by 1937, he is saying things like, America might eventually have to move to stop this. Okay. And you folks all know we did not enter the war for quite some time. One time I asked my father, who was a World War II vet, when they had actually figured out that they were going to go to war. And he said, oh, that's an easy one. When Franklin Roosevelt enacted the first peacetime draft in 1940, we pretty much knew something was up. And Roosevelt himself had been watching Europe since 36, 35. He knew what was occurring. But at home, because the first New Deal had not alleviated the conditions of the Depression fast enough, Roosevelt faced severe criticism on both the right and the left that encouraged chaos in the streets. When you think about the New Deal, one of the things you really have to think about is the social context. And for those of us who grew up as Cold War children, one of the elements that's the best example of that was the 1930s is the only time when the United States has ever had a viable communist party. And it was because people were looking around and going, wow, we're going to have a revolution, and it's either going to be on the right or the left because of the chaos and the consequences. In 1934, okay, and one of the things about these periods of reform that I pointed out to you kind of tangentially, they always occur when the same party holds both houses of Congress and the presidency. Okay. Only that kind of unity can usually pull off something like reform. And in 1934, the Democrats who already held the Congress made huge gains. And so unlike most presidents who feel that they have to get everything done in the first 2 years before they lose seats in an off-year election, Roosevelt actually was faced in 1935 with the ability to do more and start over. And it was because of the continued chaos in the country that he was able to do that. And if the first New Deal had focused on immediate recovery in an economic sense from the Depression, what the second New Deal focused on, and this continues to be one of its biggest legacies, was economic security for average people. guaranteeing the little guy a living wage. And you don't want to necessarily think of this as do-gooderism. One of the things that happened in the New Deal was that the leadership of the country became cognizant of the fact that one of the things that had caused the Depression was that America was producing more than it could consume because of the imbalance of income and because of the tariffs in the 1920s also. And so the goal becomes put enough money in people's hands so that they can consume and jumpstart the economy again. And that is the focus of the second New Deal, guaranteeing a living wage and protecting people from what people are finally coming to see as a system collapse. And you want to remember that Woodrow Wilson invented the Federal Reserve Board in the hopes of evening out the economy and being able to not have the system collapse. Federal Reserve Board had failed at that. And so the New Deal had to figure out another strategy. And if you look at the second New Deal and the actual policies, things like Social Security, the Wagner Act, which is known as the Labor Magna Carta, giving workers the right to form a union and collectively bargain. None of those policies are new. They're all things I talked to you about when I talked about the populists and the progressives. Social policies absolutely built on that earlier reform. And of course, the star of the second New Deal is the Social Security Act, which for the first time not only produces old age pensions, gives pensions to the elderly poor, but unemployment compensation. It creates the first welfare system, aid to families with dependent children. My first job out of college was as an AFTC caseworker. And now that's Children and Family Services. But the Social Security Act absolutely was designed to shore up individuals. And that's the first time ever that the US government does that. It's totally novel. When you think about Social Security, there's one thing you can say. It's taken the elderly from the poorest quadrant in the American economic system to the most stable over the course of its existence. And 3/4 of elderly Americans get the bulk of their income from Social Security. In my case, it's half. So if you want to think about the legacy of the New Deal, the most tangible policy legacy is absolutely the Social Security Act. In many ways, the second most longstanding legacy in a specific sense is the last piece of New Deal legislation, the last major piece, barely gets through in 1938, and that's the Fair Labor Standards Act, which finally forbids child labor. When you read about it, you can feel all the progressives in heaven beginning to cheer, because that had been their rallying cry. Sets the minimum wage for the first time, 40 cents an hour. And generally produces health and safety standards for workers for the first time. And that is largely considered to be the last moment of the New Deal, because by 1938, everybody's attention is to Europe. Now, the second New Deal, the conservatives begin to fight back even harder. And a matter occurs, they put pressure on Roosevelt to balance the federal budget. One of the things about the New Deal is the federal government ran a deficit for the first time ever to pay for all of these programs. And that was seen as dangerous. Balanced budgets were the key. And so Roosevelt bowed to the conservatives after he was reelected in 1936. And they tried to balance the federal budget. And what occurred in 1937 was what is known as the Roosevelt recession. The country had been slowly pulling out of the Depression and balancing the federal budget, ending the federal spending on new programs, absolutely sent the country back down into another tailspin. And then the second New Deal also triggered what becomes to be known in the 40s as the Dixiecrat Rebellion. Barbara Oberlander's discussion last week of the impact of the New Deal on civil rights was absolutely correct. And by 1937, white Southerners were beginning to see the Roosevelts as a conspiracy to overturn, quote, the Southern way of life. And the rebellion of Southern congressmen against the New Deal begins to set in by 37 or 38. So certainly by 1938, the New Deal is over. Okay. And everyone has turned to the war. When I first started thinking about what to say to you folks, this one, the reason I said this one is even harder is that if you had said to me, tell us about the legacies of the Roosevelt administration and not just the legacies of the New Deal, that's a huge, huge assignment, because Roosevelt was elected to more terms as president than any other American, elected 4 times, because he had the great bad luck or good luck, the double whammy of the Great Depression and World War II, both in his administration. And once the war broke out in earnest, there was no changing horses in that stream. And if you're fond of thinking of Roosevelt as a great leader domestically, you want to recognize that in many ways, he's even better as a leader in international affairs. And this is a guy who, Walter Lippmann, who was the greatest journalist of the age, when Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, Walter Lippmann, and this might be a paraphrase, but it's closer. Walter Lippmann wrote in a column, Franklin Roosevelt is a perfectly nice human being without any real qualifications for the job, who greatly wishes to be president. That was what Walter Lippmann said about him. So, you know, you have to understand that if you had said to me, what are the legacies of the Roosevelt administration? I would have said changing everything about the way American politics and the world works, because it's an absolutely critical time. But you held me to the New Deal. So, okay. Roosevelt was reelected in 1944 and died relatively quickly into his fourth term. And I want to start with something that Barbara mentioned the other day. She put it this way. She said Franklin Roosevelt was, and really Eleanor Roosevelt and the war were instrumental in attaching African Americans to the Democratic Party. And this is probably the most famous picture about Roosevelt's death that exists. All I had to do was say to Julie, find the picture of the African-American soldier crying. And there it is. And Roosevelt was absolutely beloved by African Americans. And when I worked for AFDC in the late 1960s, and I went into African American houses, I often found 3 pictures. And one of them was Franklin Roosevelt. By 1968, the second one was Martin Luther King. And often the third one was John Kennedy, who I'm really not going to talk about at all today. I'm going to sort of skip over him. But the first legacy of the New Deal, I'd like to take Barbara's idea and make it larger, which is that it created the coalition that is the modern day Democratic Party. If you think of the Democratic Party as minorities, women, a matter we haven't really talked about much in here, but the Roosevelt landslide in 1932 actually came about because a lot of women who had gotten the right to vote in 1920 actually showed up and voted for Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. So if you think about the Democratic Party as African Americans and other minorities and women and labor, that's what used to be called the Roosevelt Coalition. And it is still the heart of the Democratic Party today, forged in the New Deal. Okay. The second kind of reform that I think has been the most longstanding of the New Deal is expanding the government role in the economy. Before the progressives, there was no government role in the economy to speak of. And after the New Deal, there was no backing away from the government role in the economy. Franklin Roosevelt had indeed primed the pump with federal dollars to jumpstart the economy. After the Roosevelt recession and before the spending to arm us for World War II, Roosevelt embraced Keynesian economics and put the government back on deficit spending again in order to keep the economy going. And that is one, if you take an economics class, one of the two major tools the government has for affecting the economy. You can affect the economy with monetary policy, which is controlled by the Federal Reserve Board. You can control the economy, and this is really one of the legacies of the New Deal, by fiscal policy, government taxing and spending. And that tool is actually in the hands of the US Congress. And that was a tool simply not available before the New Deal. And we now think of it as the greatest tool for controlling the economy. And last, but certainly not least, okay, the notion that the government and the Constitution says this is fundamentally responsible in a crisis for the public welfare and for maintaining the economy and the economic security of individuals. In many ways, that is the greatest gift of the New Deal. And if you have been paying attention, you know that there are still people out there who, A, don't think that's a legitimate government function, and B, would really like to roll it back and be done with it. And as you're going to see, the experiments in doing that haven't worked out very well. So hold those thoughts. And now I want to talk about after Roosevelt's death. Whoop. Okay. Roosevelt died and Harry Truman took over, and ending the war was the major agenda immediately. Roosevelt is always, when you ask historians to name the greatest presidents, they always name the same three, okay? Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. If you ask them to name the near great presidents, Harry Truman often shows up on that list. Harry Truman and James K. Polk are two. And what they have in common are they're people who nobody ever expected to become president, who actually managed the job pretty efficiently and pretty effectively, despite the fact that they weren't expected to. So Harry Truman became president. Domestically, he tried to continue with the New Deal. He called it his fair deal. And he tried to expand the things that the Social Security Act had included, fund them more liberally. Also tried to add what became Medicare to the program. And he was absolutely stymied. The demobilization from the war created hyperinflation. That created new militancy on the parts of unions, and business fought back with a piece of legislation called the Taft-Hartley Act that allowed a court to issue injunctions and stop strikes. And by 1948, the Southern congressmen had created their own party called the Dixiecrat Party. The military had been integrated during World War II, and the South saw the handwriting on the wall and saw Truman as an inheritor. And it was widely thought that when Truman ran for a term on his own, that he would be defeated in 1948, but the Democratic coalition held tight for him, and he was reelected. And although he was not able to expand the New Deal programs, he was definitely able to keep them going. So he becomes the inheritor of the New Deal. In 1952, he is beaten by a Republican. And thinking about this is really fertile for what is going on in the Republican Party today. The Republican Party in 1952 was led by an old style business conservative from what I call the Calvin Coolidge school of the presidency. Robert Taft of the Taft-Hartley Act, a senator from Ohio. The leadership of the Republican Party was pretty sure that the forces set in motion by Roosevelt were going to beat them down again. So they decided to try something new. And one of my favorite historians, Eric Foner, calls Dwight Eisenhower the father of modern republicanism. I actually think that was Teddy Roosevelt, but this is a good call. And what happens is the Republican Party is corporate and business oriented and isolationist in 1952. And atomic weapons make isolationism a thing of the past. It's not gonna happen. So, and Truman has no real heir apparent. So both of the parties turn to Dwight Eisenhower, who tells them he's never voted and doesn't even really know whether he's a Democrat or a Republican. He takes a week. He comes back. He says, my people are from Kansas, so I think I must be a Republican. And with that, he becomes the Republican Party candidate. And he absolutely makes it clear to the leadership of the Republican Party that he will not touch the New Deal social legislation, that he thinks that there's no going back from that after World War II, and he doesn't. He instructs the Republicans in Congress not to attack it. And then he uses Roosevelt economics to engage in the largest public works project ever in the history of this country, the building of the interstate highway system. And the administration puts out that it's for defense purposes, but it's actually more priming of the economic pump a la Roosevelt. So what Eisenhower proves is the solidity of what Roosevelt has done. He's a Republican who essentially makes his reputation on using Roosevelt's various techniques. And these are some pictures of the interstate system. He also inherits the civil rights movement. And he is personally quite lukewarm to the notion of integration. He makes one pass at integrating the schools, Little Rock High School, and that is enough for him. He drags his heels, and his vice president, Richard Nixon, begins talking about building a new Republican Party on what he calls the Southern strategy. And everyone in this room can see that that worked pretty darn well. But there was no stopping the civil rights movement. By the end of Eisenhower's term, Brown versus the Board of Education had occurred. The Montgomery bus boycott had occurred. Martin Luther King had emerged as a hero from the Montgomery bus boycott. And Eisenhower didn't assist, but he didn't fight against it. And that, of course, was what John Kennedy inherited. And if you look at Kennedy's record, in terms of the economy, he actually kind of takes a step backward from the Roosevelt administration's government intrusion into the economy. But very quickly, his attention is absorbed by two things: the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam, which actually begins to ramp up in Kennedy's administration, even though we had been involved there since World War II. Truman was the first American president to involve us basically in Vietnam. So Eisenhower goes out of office, Kennedy beats Nixon, and then Kennedy is assassinated. And then Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And if there's anyone who's responsible for keeping the New Deal welfare aspects of the program alive, it is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, first of all, revered Franklin Roosevelt. He came from a poor Texas family that had been saved by the New Deal. And he referred to the New Deal as saving his people. He went to Washington as a young congressman during the New Deal. He was absolutely devoted to its principles. And when I was doing research for this, I discovered something I hadn't known, which is that when he was in the Senate, he was the first person to introduce a civil rights bill in the US Senate before he was vice president or president. So when you think about the achievements of the Johnson administration, you actually have to know that he'd been working on them for his entire political career. And he came to the presidency from the position of having been majority leader in the Senate. So he was, in many ways, the president who was most effective in terms of dealing with Congress. I tell people I'm pretty sure in terms of effectiveness, Lyndon Johnson is the best domestic president of the modern age. You guys know Vietnam totally did him in. But here are some of the achievements. Okay. First of all, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I personally think in terms of impact on my own life, it is the single most significant piece of legislation that has been passed in my lifetime. Okay. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also cementing the African American support for the Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson is definitely the inheritor of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman in that regard. But anybody know what the big picture is? Can you guess? Who's the other person? Harry Truman. This is Lyndon Johnson signing the Medicare and Medicaid bill. Johnson not only continued the New Deal programs, but he extended them. His administration is responsible for both Medicaid and Medicare. Then there is the last great wave of reform in American history. It comes to be known as the Great Society. At its heart is a really incredible idea, namely, we'll get rid of poverty. It takes the government's guarantee of economic security to a whole different level. And in fact, in the decades after the war on poverty, you would have declared it a success. It took the poverty rate in America from 22% to 13% in a 4-year period. But it did it in the way that the business community hated, by using government as an employer of last resort and by expanding what people thought of as welfare state matters. One of the transitions I was witness to when I was an AFDC caseworker is that when I first started, there were no food stamps. And the only food assistance was an outgrowth of Roosevelt's agricultural policies, by the way, a surplus commodities program where poor people could go and get surplus agricultural commodities. And what Johnson succeeded in doing was turning that into the food stamp program, which exists today. But Johnson was very clear about the fact that he was extending and building on the New Deal, which he revered and loved. After Johnson, there was, as you can tell, a series of Republican presidents. And that marked the beginning of what we have been all seeing now, namely a return to what I call market fundamentalism. Walter Lippmann said laissez-faire was dead, but they did not put a spear through its heart, for sure. And after the Johnson years, there's essentially a return to a support for unbridled capitalism in a lot of different ways. And the result of that was a series of recessions, one in the 1990s, and a particularly bad one in 2005 and 6. So bad that the history books call it the Great Recession. We all lived through it. And the result was the election of Barack Obama. How about this one? What is he signing? The Affordable Care Act. One of the things that had been one of Franklin Roosevelt's greatest hope was that all Americans would have access to health care, not just the poor. But you want to recognize that the affordable health care is a legacy of the New Deal. The Affordable Health Care Act is a legacy of the New Deal. You also want to recognize that Obama used New Deal economic techniques to get us out of the recession. I have to say that the last balanced budget, anybody know when the last balanced budget was submitted? It's Clinton administration. And so the Great Recession caused President Obama to use deficit spending, just as Roosevelt had, to try to pull us out of it. And the Affordable Care Act is definitely an inheritor of the New Deal. And then last but not least, we had a little economic downturn recently caused by that odd thing, the pandemic, that people seem to have forgotten about. There was never a greater testimony to the legacies of the New Deal than the way President Biden handled the economy in the wake of an absolute crisis. First of all, direct government payments to individuals to relieve the problems of unemployment that couldn't be jump-started. And then how do we jump-start the economy after the pandemic? The same way the Roosevelt administration did in the New Deal. You pass an infrastructure bill and you put people to work, building roads, schools, bridges. It's an absolute return to the New Deal. And this is President Biden signing the infrastructure bill. So I trust that I have persuaded you that the New Deal and its policies and philosophies were so powerful that we are living in a New Deal world.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Really excellent. Questions, please.
You mentioned the communist movement during the 30s, but there was another movement, and that was fascist.
Mm.
There was
Oh,
an
Father
actually
Coughlin. Oh,
pro-Hitler movement in this country until the Roosevelt administration identified the source of it, which was a naturalized German who had come in and was leading this. Today, it still exists. It's not pro-Hitler per se, but it's definitely fascist, and they even call themselves Nazis. That really bothers me. It's supported by certain media. But my question to you is, you referred to the first New Deal and the second New Deal. Could you please distinguish between those?
Yeah, first of all, most of the first New Deal was basically designed to get people jobs and get money in people's hands. And those programs were almost all overturned by the Supreme Court within a year and a half. Okay. The NRA and the AAA were both gone after about a year and a half after they had been enacted. And the second New Deal was much more focused on labor issues, on what I called guaranteeing people a living wage, and being able to strike for a living wage. It was upheld by the courts. Okay. Part of the reason that we have Social Security is that the nature of the Supreme Court changed. And some of you probably know that Roosevelt threatened to pack the court. Then he didn't have to, as it turned out. One of the things they did was to sweeten the retirement for Supreme Court justices. And after they did that, 3 justices stepped down and Roosevelt instantly had 3 appointments. So the second New Deal programs last. That's one big difference. The first New Deal is sort of thrown by the wayside. I think of the first New Deal as sort of a rough draft of what actually occurs. And once he has this overwhelming congressional support after 34, he's able to move much more aggressively and on a larger scale.
Okay. What year and in what administration do we attribute the birth of deficit spending in the federal government, American federal government? And if you have that information, back in history, what government internationally introduced the whole concept of deficit spending to the federal government?
Okay, so we had run a deficit during World War One. And one of the things I said the first day was that it wasn't Franklin Roosevelt who brought big government to Washington. It was Woodrow Wilson during World War One. And that's the first time that the government does that on a large scale. But what many people think of Roosevelt as the person who brought it in as an economic tool, because in the 30s, he and many heads of state became enamored of economic theories by John Maynard Keynes, who advocated that in a crisis, deficit spending was the best tool you could use to jumpstart the economy. And by the end of the Second New Deal, by 1938, Roosevelt was talking openly about his admiration for Keynesian economics and about the fact that fiscal policy was the most short-term effective way to deal with a crisis, either a war or either a war or a depression. But the
we have one question on Zoom here. It says, could you speak to Republican attempts to dismantle various New Deal programs and successes and failures?
Whoa. Let me answer that question broadly and go back to what I said earlier. What the New Deal did was to create the bases for the two political parties. And what occurs is that the Democrats have espoused the New Deal philosophy that says government should guarantee a certain measure of economic security to its citizens, that in a crisis, the government should be the place of last resort in terms of pulling the country out of it. And the Republican Party, since the end of the Civil War, has been the party of America's business interests. And from 1938 forward, those businesses have disliked government regulation. Think about deregulation as a movement. And when that was very, very prominent in the Bush years, especially, I used to just say quietly to people, well, you should think about what caused those regulations to be in place for the first time. And I kind of made reference to this when a lot of those regulations were reduced. It was at the behest of the Republican Party to unfetter business, but also in a way to allow that older coalition to gain power again. At lunch, we were talking about the rise of Fox News. And I said, Fox News and MSNBC on both sides are both the result of deregulation in the Reagan years. Before that time, the Federal Communications Commission had two two regulations. The Fair Standards Rule and the Equal Time Rule. And those regulations required that if television stations took a position on a political matter, that they had to give both sides. And during the Reagan administration, commissioners were appointed who said, no, we don't need this anymore. People have cable TV. They don't just have the 3 networks. And there's plenty of choice. And so we don't need to regulate this. And they did away with them. And Rupert Murdoch had Fox News on the air faster than the speed of light. And by the way, their argument was that people had access to cable now. At the point at which they did this, 38% of Americans had cable. So to be honest with you, what has occurred is that we live continuously in a historical tension that's reflected in our 2 political parties. And when the Republican Party is elected, they will try to give the business interests as close to laissez-faire as they can, even if it produces enormous scandals, which in fact it has. Have you seen a savings and loan company lately, any of you? And the Democratic Party, when they are returned to power, will use Keynesian economics and all the tools the Roosevelt administration invented to try to clean up the mess. And that's as clearly as I can put it.
That's maybe a good place to end. And we thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for sticking with our New Deal presentation. This kind of thing is always fun to look back at what has shaped our country's history and how it carries forward even to today. And we'll try to bring you more of those in the future. Thank you.